So thank you. One of the last projects the late architect and architectural historian Anthony Wolfe was focused on was the history of Cali House. He was fascinated by the numerous architects engaged by its owners, the Murrays of Broughton, and was keen to clarify the muddled story of Cali House found in publications and databases. This talk presents the results of the research by Anthony to tell the story of the people and the building from the early 18th century until its sale in 1933. Anthony opened his office in Gatehouse of Fleet in 1952 and had first-hand experience of Cali House when he was commissioned to be the architect for alterations and modernisation of the hotel in the late 1950s. Here we can see a new rear entrance and the lift shaft that was implemented by Anthony. He had a long and successful career as a practicing architect until his retirement in 2012, aged 92. And after his retirement, he continued his interest in historic buildings and was still researching the architects who were involved with Cali House the week before he died in 2016. He was responsible for various changes himself. And here we can see before and after, the before on the right, and then the lowered ceilings of 1958 in a corridor. He became intrigued by the relationship between the Murrays of Broughton and other architects who played a part in the design and subsequent alterations of Cali House, now Cali Palace. He was also involved in these modern furnishings in the late 1950s, and these are another example of the desire to keep up with the times that was a continuing theme throughout the history of Cali House. But to give it some context, this is an artist's impression of a 12th century motte that's still in Cali. You can see it, and shows that the alluvial plain in the River Fleet was an attractive place, a location to settle. This is Blau's 1654 map, and it shows a tower house and parkland. And Richard Murray of Broughton, which was originally an estate in the Maccas, had inherited Cali through marriage in 1661. This was passed to his son John in 1690. Alexander Murray inherited the estates of Broughton, Cali and Killybegs from his elder brother in 1704. Alexander Murray married Euphemia Stewart, daughter of the Earl of Galloway, in 1726. By the 1740s, he'd purchased a townhouse in Coombey, still known as Broughton House, and in the care of the National Trust of Scotland. Sometimes unlikely sources prove to be useful in proving our understanding of the changes that have occurred in the past. A newspaper report of a speech given in the opening of the new town hall in Gatehouse of Fleet in 1885 included a quote that helps to explain the transition from the tower house to a middle mansion, which was then replaced by the present building. This is Roy's map of the 1750s. And although it doesn't show the tower house, the arrow shows where the likely middle mansion was at Gatehouse. And as you can see, the village didn't exist at that time, and the red lines show that the lands were beginning to be enclosed. The quote explains that the Murray Arms was erected before there was a town, at about the same time that the mills were built. It was the former mansion house of Cali. The Murray Arms was the former mansion house of Cali. An older tower house which stood beside the lake had been disused for several hundred years, and what might have been called the middle mansion house stood a little on the rising ground beyond where the present stables are. When the present mansion house was built, the previous mansion was removed stone by stone and re-erected in exactly the same pattern as seen here. So we believe that from that newspaper article that the Murray Arms was in fact a previous mansion of Cali House. The Murrays of Broughton papers in the National Archives show us that Alexander had ambitions to develop a new mansion and gardens at Cali. Correspondence dated 1742 between Naismith, Murray's fixer in Edinburgh, and architect William Adam concerned a great house and suggested that the extent of grounds to be laid out was to be no more than the gardens about the house and an avenue. Notably, the letter includes a request to concert a plan of what you propose to be built betwixt the two pavilions you, that's Alexander Murray, have already done. The building was not constructed, and it's not known what advice was given for the gardens and pleasure grounds. However, Roy's map of the 1750s reveals a great deal about Cali and the changes being made to the surrounding landscape, and clearly shows the two pavilions shown here with the arrow next to the word Cali, and also what appears to be some avenue planting towards Gatehouse of Fleet, as well as, of course, the buildings associated with the former mansion. Alexander Murray died in 1750. By this time, William Adam, the architect, had already died. He died in 1748. And we don't really know what advice he provided, but by the early 1800s, William Adam's sons published many of his designs in a book called Victorius Scoticus, which showed a design for Cali mansions, although we don't know whether this mansion was proposed between the two existing pavilions or whether these were new pavilions that were being proposed. Anyway, this proposal was not constructed. James Murray inherited the estate on his father's death and married his cousin, Lady Catherine Stewart. She immediately took into her household a daughter, Anne, a natural child of her husband who was born the previous year. The couple also had a daughter of their own, Alicia, who died at a young age. Like his father, James Murray speculated by acquiring and selling property. In the late 1750s, he purchased Auchencruve Estate. He instructed Robert Adam, who was the son of William Adam, to design and build a new mansion house at Auchencruve. But while it was still under construction, he sold the estate to Oswald, who modified the design of the mansion that was eventually completed in 1767. In 1756, the same year James Murray sold Broughton House in Kirkcudbright, he asked Isaac Ware to produce a grand Palladian design for Cali, although again, this design was not implemented. The Stuart Galloway House archives provide evidence of the family influence on the development of Cali. Architect Robert Milne met Lord Garles, Murray's cousin and brother-in-law, when he was on a grand tour. Milne acted as an agent sourcing works of art and musical instruments for Lord Garles, and at the request of Lord Garles, he sent an initial design for Cali from Rome in 1759. The drawings and a letter describing a house in great detail include instructions: if the measures of the whole house are too large or too small, decrease or enlarge the scale. This appears to be exactly what was done, and the building that was completed in 1765 was shrunk to fit the purse, or perhaps even the space between the pre-existing pavilions. The layout of the house was much altered, but the elevation was very similar to the original sketch. Published material provides information about the Murrays family. S.R. Crockett's Raiderland includes notes from a diary of a local landowner. William Cunningham visited the house in 1786, only to find none of the family living there. He had arrived at an awkward time for the family, just after James Murray had left for England with Grace Johnson. Grace had been the governess at Cali and had many connections with the area, as her grandfather had been a minister in the local parish church and her brother an MP for the area. Although little can be found about the couple's disappearance in the Murray archives, there are letters in other archives which give us a clue to the magnitude of the scandal. The Stewart of Chambelly papers at Dumfries archives include a letter sent by Euphemia to Anne, her adopted daughter, who was now married, asking the family not to speak to her husband, as long as his frenzy remains. In fact, his frenzy remained for some time, and Grace gave birth to 4 children while they lived in England. In 1794, Cali was altered by Thomas Boyd, an architect in Dumfries, to add accommodation for the return of Murray. He was planning to return with his extended family, and new stories were added to the pavilions to provide additional bedrooms and living quarters to accommodate his wife, partner, and 4 children. So here you can see the 2 pavilions have been raised in level, and the connection between them has been enlarged as well. Meanwhile, developments were still happening in the grounds, and at least through one reference, James Ramsay is thought to have been involved in the design of the grounds and gardens, and may have been the architect for the temple, which was built in 1779. James Murray died in 1799, and Alexander, his illegitimate 5-year-old son, inherited the estate. Trustees acted on behalf of Alexander until he came of age in 1810. In 1816, Alexander married Lady Anne Bingham. She was the daughter of the Earl of Lucan, who had employed John Buonarroti Papworth as his architect. Papworth drawings are held in the RIBA drawings collection in the V&A and show us many proposals for lodges, entranceways, and much, much more. Most of the early designs do not seem to have been implemented, with perhaps the exception of Belvedere Lodge. Lady Anne's Charity School for Girls was built about this time, but there is no evidence to show that it was a Papworth design. Some alterations for the house by Papworth were undertaken and included a chapel and a pillared stone veranda for Lady Anne's apartment, which this is a drawing of here. And in the bottom left there, just notice that it mentions the chapel end, which implies that there is a chapel already constructed at that time, or about to be constructed, which is in 1825. The earliest reference to chapels is in Robert Burns' election ballad of 1795, which includes the line, "And hay for the sanctified Murray, our land who with chapels has stored." This has been interpreted to mean James Murray had become an outwardly pious towards the end of his life and established an Episcopal Chapel at Cali. Certainly an academy built about this time included a chapel and also a schoolmaster's house, and was in use by 1799, the year he died. The chapel appears to have been in use until 1820, when it was closed down and demolished along with the academy. Only the schoolmaster's house was left standing, which is now known as Cushat Wood. Here we can see Papworth's drawing of a chapel at Cali from 1824. Papworth was appointed again in the 1830s to extend and modernise Cali House and gardens, and construction works continued until 1842. Inspection of this drawing here includes designs for a chapel as well as alterations. It's difficult to establish what was proposed and what was implemented. This Papworth drawing shows proposals for roads, stables, and gated entrance, and none of these were implemented. But it does show the same footprint at the bottom left there. The extension, you can see that it's the same footprint for the chapel as is shown in the 1820s design. So it may be that the chapel was first built in the 1820s. Okay, so well, this is a very useful sketch done by Mrs. Smith. It's particularly useful because almost all the architectural drawings of Cali House omit the chapel. I think it's because it made the building look unsymmetrical. So sometimes there's a very faint line, or usually a bush or something put in the way, so that we didn't actually have any evidence of the chapel being built, except for from this sketch. We do have early photographs where we can just about see that there is a chapel at the far left-hand side there, and also here you can see Lady Anne's Terrace. And also another thing to notice is that the windows on the building there have been raised and altered, and that's part of the Papworth refurbishment, because internally he raised the ceiling of the drawing room and made the floor above smaller, and then added lots of elaborate moldings and fireplaces and other things within the house. And in fact, those elaborate moldings were some of the things that Anthony was covering up when he lowered the ceiling, when we saw that photograph right at the beginning from the 1950s. So Papworth was employed in the 30s to remodel the house. And in 1831, this one shows that he was proposing to build a portico, and also there were some alterations to the links to the wings. And as you can see in this drawing, there is no sign of a chapel, but we're pretty certain that it was already there. By 1837, there were much more ambitious alterations proposed, recladding the two wings in granite, and building the portico is a much grander affair. And you might be able to see on the left-hand side there, the left-hand side wing, that there is a pencil sketch of a clock tower in there, as if there may have been a clock tower proposed, or at least thought about. And here we can see early photograph, an undated photograph, which shows that most of the works on that drawing were in fact implemented, and including a very, very modest clock at the end there, you can see. So Horatio inherited Cali in 1845, aged 11. And at that time, the estate was in great debt, and everything had to be sold. All the movables, all the furnishings had to be sold. But gradually, the finances began to be improved. And in 1858, he married Anne Wingfield Digby. This painting is actually hung in Stuart Tree Museum, so you can all see it there, of Horatio and Anne. Belfast architects Lanyon and Lynn were commissioned to construct another chapel in 1857, perhaps influenced by Horatio's imminent marriage to a minister's daughter. That chapel was not constructed, but the Scots baronial entrance lodges we're certain were built by Lanyon and Lynn, although they're often attributed to either William Byrne or David Bryce. So between the first edition Ordnance Survey map and the second edition map of 1896, there were substantial alterations. The wing on our left there has been extended, and also there's a new chapel with a curved end built in there. We know that the chapel was really important at this time. The History Society will know of the timetable that's recently been discovered in Gatehouse, which includes daily prayers at 9 AM and at 10 PM, as well as services on a Sunday. So the chapel was really important, but we don't really know who did this work, or we're not certain. What we do know is that Pilkington had designed the clock tower in Gatehouse of Fleet in 1871, and Pilkington and Bell were architects for Cali House, and we think they were architects for the chapel. And also research suggests that the Pilkington and Bell were also responsible for the alterations to the west wing. So the enlargement of the west wing and the chapel can be seen in this photograph here. You can see a much taller, plainer chapel there. So Horatio died without issue in 1904. So at that time, Cali passed to his cousin, Colonel William Bailey, or became Murray Bailey. It then passed on to his son, Major Frederick Murray Bailey, and then on to his daughter, Elizabeth. And when she married, she became Elizabeth Murray Usher. And we all know that the hotel and the policy was sold to the Forestry Commission in 1933, which is when we come to an end of 200 years of the Murrays of Broughton and their relationships with architects. As a summary, this is really what we now know, that Alexander Murray appointed William Adam to provide advice and designs, but these were not built, although they were published eventually in the 1810-11 time. James Murray appointed Robert Adam to build a mansion at Auchengrove, but then sold it before it was built. He also appointed Isaac Ware to design a building, but that was unbuilt, and eventually selected Robert Milne through his brother-in-law's connections, and the mansion was built in 1765. Thomas Boyd, an architect from Dumfries, was then employed to extend and alter the building in 1794. Alexander Murray commissioned Papworth in the 1820s, and we believe that the chapel was built then, and various other buildings probably around the estate. Papworth was then appointed again in the 1830s, and this time his proposals for additions, remodeled public rooms, chapel, revised chapel and portico were all undertaken. When Horatio inherited the estate, he appointed Lanyon and Lynn from Belfast to remodel the west wing and chapel, but this was not done, although they then did do the avenues, or the lodges at the end of the avenue. And finally, Pilkington and Bell remodeled the west wing in the 1870s. So that's the story of the relationship between the Murrays of Broughton and their architects. Of course, it doesn't end there. We know that there were lots of other changes that happened to the hotel, with the glazed dining room added in 1955, and a residential block, the Forest Wing, added in 1974. And the chapel, which can just be seen at the far right there, was eventually demolished in 1990. Really apologise for the break in the talk, but hopefully that is a summary of the relationship between the Murrays of Broughton and their architects. Thank you.
Thank you very much.